For this video, we are going to be playing another standalone single session of Magic the Gathering solo role-playing. Welcome back, gamers. This video is a continuation of an experiment that we are doing in trying to use Magic the Gathering cards as a basis for solo role-playing. Now, this is going to be a standalone session, which means that I'm going to do the entire narrative arc here in one seating and try to wrap it up in a decent amount of time. If you're interested in following along with the rules, we have previously we put videos out where we have gone through the rules set. There's also a PDF that lays out the entire rules system. If you're interested in trying this on your own, as always, I'm extremely thankful for any feedback and criticism and positive comments that you can give to try to make this system even better. Now, I can mention as we begin this session, everything that you see here is entirely improvised, which means I have no idea which cards are coming. I have no idea where this story is going to go. There will be no editing here. It's going to be a straight stream of solo improvised RPG. And what that means is some things may go better than others, but hopefully in the end we'll have something of a narrative arc that holds together, and we'll have hopefully a lot of fun as well. Well, let's begin, before we even get into the narrative, let's begin with setting up the scene, which is a crucial part of this game. Now, we're going to do this now by starting out with our character. Now, I'm going to say this. I'm going to use an elf. I'm just going to pick an elf, and we will say an elf. Let's see. How about an elf sage? We'll start out with an elf sage, and we'll say the elf sage has a background as a thief, and that itself might introduce some interesting narrative role-playing elements. So an elf sage with a thief. Now let's go to the name. We need a name for our hero here. So let's throw some cards down. Treetop. Let's see. Treetarch. 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 So that will be the name of our hero. Now we're going to need a setting where we are starting out our story. So let's flip this over. And oh, look at this. We have Ravaged Highlands. Now that is a cool card because there's already some cool elements in it. Let me take a look at it. Yeah, we've got a beautiful mountain in the background. And we've got some buildings that have been kind of destroyed. This is where we are going to begin with Treetarch, our Elf Sage Thief, in the Ravaged Highlands. Now we're going to need a name for this place that he comes from. So let's go ahead and pick out a name for the Ravaged Highlands. What is the name of his village? Let's see. Stormscape, Storshim. That'll be at Storshim. So the village in the Ravaged Highlands is Storshim. And that's where our Elf Sage Thief Treetarch begins his story. We always like to pick out the goal, too, for these sessions. So let's put 5 cards down and pick out a main goal towards which our arc is heading, which is going to be the impetus for the story and the narrative. So let's throw 5 cards down and take a look at what we get. All right. So here we go. Let me take a closer look at these here. Interesting. Okay, I think I'm actually going to go with the Mending Touch card here. This looks really fascinating. So we can say this. The goal of this session now is going to be to go someplace and resurrect someone who has been slain. A friend, perhaps? Could it be an enemy? Could it be a relative? Well, I think we'll find that out as we go. But here's going to be our goal, is to resurrect and actually, let's ask the question, is this a friend? Let's go to our oracle. Start off right away with our oracle here. Is this a friend? We have 3, so it is no. So it's not a friend that we're going to resurrect. It is going to be something of, oh, I got it. Yes, we'll say that it's not a friend, but it is going to be somebody who has been in competition with Treetarch. So something of a competitor. Someone from his youth who he has been in competition with. So we're going to say this. We need a name for this person as well. So resurrect the competitor. And this competitor, we are going to give them a name. Let's give this competitor a name. Grayban or Grayban. Grayban. So the goal is to go to a certain place, resurrect this competitor Grayban, because there's some unsettled business that they were not able to deal with in life. So that is what we're going to do here, and we need to figure out where we are trying to go. So let's draw another card. It's a forest card. Okay, so we're going to have to go to the forest, which is at the foothills of our Ravaged Highlands of Storshim. We're going to have to go down to the forest to find where this person is, where he has been slain in order to resurrect him. And let's give the name of the forest a name as well. Somberwalds, misstep, let's see, Somismer. Yes, I like that. Somismer. Sommismir. Somismir. The forest of Somismir. Perfect. So now we have a goal. We have a place that we are heading. We have a starting point. We have our character. And with that, we're actually able now to dive into the narrative element. So let's begin with our first narrative hook of the session. 5 cards. Let's draw these out. Okay. All right. Let's start here with Casting Bones. We'll take this card right here. Let me take a quick look at it so I can see if there's anything in the narrative can be used. I can use for the narrative here to begin. Casting of Bones. Okay. Let's begin our narrative. It's early in the morning when our hero, Treetarch, is abruptly woken from his sleep. There's something of a ruckus out in the central area of this small village of Storshim, in which he has lived his entire life. Many, many years ago, he had a close friend who he grew up with, a friend named Grayban. And Grayban and Storshim grew up together in this village, and they were competing for the hand of an elf maiden in the village. It was the daughter of the chieftain. And there was a competition between them for many, many years for who would be able to marry this elf daughter. And let's actually go ahead and give her a name. What is her name? Tidys is her name, the elf. Tidys, Tidys. Now, in their competition for this, the hand of Tidys, some bad blood came in between them. And it became so bad that one day, Storshim came into Grayban and challenged him in a duel. Now, Grayban, sensing that he would not be victorious in the duel, fled. And he took off out of the village of Storshim, down the Ravaged Highlands, where he disappeared into the forest below, the forest of Somismir. And that's the backstory to the ruckus that woke up Treetarch from his sleep this morning. For the noise that he heard was screaming, shouting by other elf citizens of this village. he groggily ran out of his hut. This village is pretty worn down. There's a lot of broken down buildings, stone crumbling off the corners of these buildings. His hut itself is pretty decent, but it still requires some repairs. This is obviously not a very wealthy area. It's a rather impoverished area. It's the kind of area that people generally leave from and they never come back. Treetarch has stayed here his entire life. As he stumbles out of his hut, he comes into the square where he sees sitting on the ground with a group of people around him is the local sage. He can't quite make out what is happening, so he pushes his way forward through the crowds. There's about 70 or 80 people standing in a circle. And as he pushes his way through, he hears this chanting noise coming from the sage and an odd rattling. He pushes his way through, putting his shoulders down, until he comes to the inner circle, where he sees now a rattling of bones, a skeleton jumping around on the ground. The sage is humming some sort of dirge at the same time, and immediately a vision comes to him. He stands up, as if his eyes are transformed. He begins to look around the circle, his voice changing, and he says, "I am no more. I have fallen. It is I, Grayban, son of this village, but I am no more." The sage falls down to his knees in the dust once again, and the village around lets out this gasp and scream, and immediately the relatives of Grayban begin to weep, because they take this as a sign, a message that their long-lost son, cousin, relative has passed away. In his gut, Treetarch feels an ambivalent sense. Part of him is overjoyed at this news. This is his long-hated foe, his competitor. But part of him also feels like an injustice has happened, that the conflict between them has not yet been resolved. And he feels this overwhelming sense of sorrow over that. Because more than anything else in his life, he wants to be avenged for the loss of his honor in his fight with Grayban for Tita's hand. Treetarch pushes his way out of the circle, returning to his hut, where immediately he begins to throw supplies together, because he doesn't believe that this is the end of the story for Grayban. He has to go investigate this situation himself. So he begins to pack up his supplies. Food, weapons, clothes in his pack. And as he turns to exit from his hut with the pack on, ready to head down the mountain face, he's met at the doorway by his mother. His mother's name is Skyfern. She greets Treetarch at the doorway, her long white hair flowing in the wind as it blows through the various buildings of this village. She stops him. "My son, I know your plans. I know that this has haunted you for years. My son, let him go. Let him go. Let all of this go. Let it die with Grayban." Treetarch stares into his mother's eyes. "Mother, you know that I cannot. You know that my own life is intertwined with his, and and my honor and my name rests with him. I cannot rest until I am sure that this is over. And with that, he pushes his way past his mother. She turns, falls to her knees. You can see the tears begin to stream down her face as she knows that her son is chasing after this ghost that has been haunting him for years. This ghost of anger, resentment, hatred. But Treetarch knows that he has a bigger task in front of him. He leaves his mother in the dust and begins to walk down the hills from the highlands. As he is walking down the treacherous paths leading from the peaks of his village, he notices something incredible. Something he hasn't seen in many, many years, at least 2 decades. He comes around a corner of a rocky outcropping. And there, off in the distance, almost imperceptible, is a small figure that is pulling something of a cart coming out of the mouth of a cave. And from a far distance, he sees something of a golden helmet with 2 horns coming out, and he immediately recognizes this as one of the dwarven people that is buried, that has their home buried deep within the mountains upon which Treetarch and his village reside. Treetarch very carefully pulls out his blade and ever so quietly begins to move around the rock outcropping. And now we need to take a challenge here, a stealth challenge, because this is going to be a really important stealth check for him. And I'm going to say, I didn't mention this in the beginning, but we are going to give our hero 30 hit points, which means he also has a +3, which means he gets 3 reroll cards. So we will say that this is going to be a normal check. So let's go ahead and say we need 3 in a row here. There's 2 evens and there's an odd. We will throw that one away. Take our next card. And there is a 3rd even. So he is successful. Treetarch is successfully able to sneak around this rock outcropping. And he comes now right alongside this dwarf who cannot even sense that he is there. He doesn't even hear him. He pulls out his blade and immediately jumps down in front of the dwarf and says, "You! Where are you heading? What are you doing up in these parts? Why have you left the mountain?" Now the question is, how is this dwarf going to respond? And the question is he going to be aggressive when this comes back? Let's ask our oracle. Is he going to be aggressive? And we have a 4, which is a yes. So immediately taken back by this surprise, the dwarf drops his cart that he is pulling, and he jumps out in front of our hero, and he puts his shoulder down, trying to attack him. And we're going to say now, let's run into combat, and let's go ahead and say that now the dwarf has initiative now because he's taking the first attack. The question is he able to attack our hero and to knock him over? Let's take out our 3 cards and see how we are doing here. 3. Wow, 7 on the attack, plus his will give him a +2, so he has a 9. And our hero with this +3, there's 3s, 5, 8, 9. Oh, he is going to be able to avoid it with a 10. So as the dwarf puts his shoulder down, charges into him, excuse me, Treetarch steps aside, and the dwarf falls flat on his face, screaming with frustration. Now let's stop the combat there for a second as Treetarch steps back, holding his blade down, facing the dwarf. He says, "You, speak quickly before I lower this blade into your neck." The dwarf turns over, prone on the ground, seeing his helplessness, gives up his aggression. He turns up and says, I'm on my way down the hill. Let me go in peace, and I won't bother you anymore. I will let you live. Treetarch laughs a bit from that, seeing the position he's in, the position of advantage. You will leave me. You will leave me in one piece, eh? I have the upper position here, the upper hand. Obviously, I have the power. Speak quickly. What are you doing? Why are you going down the hill? The dwarf looks at him and stares deep into his eyes, judging whether or not he should be forthright and honest. Why should I tell you? You should tell me because I have a blade pointed at your neck. Well, a threat is never a good way to make friends now, is it? Friends? I have never been with the dwarves, and I have no intentions of being that. Why are you going down the mountain? Why are you passing through our territory? Let's actually draw a card. A couple cards here to see what is going on. Why is the dwarf heading down this hill? We'll say this. We'll take this card in the center here. The dwarf turns to him and says, obviously you haven't heard about the gathering of the druids. There is some dark and deep evil magic at work down there. Down in the hills, down in the mountains, down in the forest parts. There's dark and evil magic at work. And I've been sent by my village to investigate, and if so, to prevent any further magical problems making their way into our mountain. What do you mean there's a group of druids? I've never heard of this, Treetarch responds. And the dwarf responds ever so slightly. We've been losing people in our mountain. People have been dying left and right. We've been losing people. And we've been receiving messages through our magic workers that these druids are responsible. With that, Treetarch pulls back, pauses for a second, and a light goes on inside of his head. A light goes on reminding him of what he just witnessed no less than an hour before. The message that came to his own village sage about the death of Grayban. He doesn't share this with the dwarf, but he begins to make something of a connection that perhaps Grayban's death is connected to these druids. Holding the knife out, Treetarch looks back at the dwarf again. I will accompany you down to these druids. We shall investigate this together. We shall not be friends, but we shall investigate this, because this is of some interest to me and my village as well. The dwarf looks up. Very well. You may join me, but I ain't sharing any of my supplies with you. I ain't protecting you. If you get in trouble, I leave. Very well. Let's get a name for our dwarf. Sigilval. Our dwarf's name will be Sigival. Sigil. Sigival. Sigival is our dwarf. So together, this Elf Sage Theif, Treetarch, and this small, war-worn dwarf named Sigival begin to make their way down the mountain, heading towards the forest. Not much is shared between them, other than their intentions, their goals, things they are looking for in an attempt to find these druids. They walk for what seems to be several hours before they come to the very edge of the tree line where the forest begins. And they look down into the forest, and it is a dark, gloomy space. Hardly any sunlight is able to make its way through the dense foliage as it becomes denser and denser the further down the mountain they move. And Sigurval looks over at Treetarch, and he says to him, "Now's your time to turn back, but I head forward." And he pulls out something of a long axe. At least it's long for him. He's a rather short dwarf. An axe that he pulls up. And it says, "Things may get bloody and dangerous. Turn back if you will." And Treetarch, with this motivation of revenge, of avenging his honor, looks back and says, "I will follow you because my purposes are greater." And the two of them step together into this forest. Let's go ahead and pull some cards up here. Oh boy, okay. So let's go ahead and take this card in the center, Sundering Growth. And it is a picture here of this tree tearing a horse in two. The two of them begin to walk ever so slowly through this thick foliage, picking their way over twisted roots, through branches and undergrowth. And the entire time, Sigurval is swiping his axe left and right, trying to break through this dense foliage. Treetarch is getting scratched upon his arms. You see the deep scratches and cuts are into his arms and his legs, and he's beginning to bleed. Blood is running down his arms. Blood is running into his clothing from the thorns of these trees and of this undergrowth, this underbrush. They begin to move ever so slowly, heading towards what looks to be a clearing a bit off in the distance. And they get to this area where the trees now become even larger than before. The thickness, a diameter of maybe 5-6 feet across. These enormous trees with the root system moving all around in all sorts of tangled directions. At this point, they have to move over, under, through, around these enormous roots that are as thick as the torso of Treetarch. And they get to a point now where Sigurval has to actually crawl underneath one of the roots. Treetarch holding back, letting him go through first, preparing himself to follow. And just as Sigurval gets right underneath the largest root, there's a cracking noise. And out of the corner of his eye, Treetarch sees how suddenly the branches and the roots begin to take form, almost like tentacles on an octopus. And immediately, one of the roots above Sigurval wraps around him with this incredible force and lightning speed, grasping, squeezing, and pulling Sigurval in such tightness and strength. You see Sigurval scream as the blood rushes to his head, and the root tears him into two pieces, falling down, and the corpse of this dwarf rolling down, and suddenly Treetarch looks to his right and he sees another tree, roots shooting out at him. And let's go ahead now and roll initiative here to see what is going to happen in this situation. The trees which begin with them, we will give them no bonus because they are a tree, but we go a 5 for the initiative. Sigurval is going to roll and he will get a 3, 4, 5, 6 plus is 3, 9. So Sigurval, seeing the root coming flying at him, is going to immediately dive out of the way and run as quickly as he can out of the range of these trees. And because he was able to take the first action, he's able to do that, pulling himself out of range of these trees. He looks back and seeing the roots, the branches slowly lowering down, and the other tree where Sigivald had been walking, the roots begin wrapping around him, pulling what is left of the dwarf into the sand like quicksand, pulling him underneath down into the root system where who knows what will happen. Treetarch can only imagine that the trees will be slowly feasting upon him and getting nourishment for the coming weeks and months. Shaken up, Treetarch is stepping backwards, now on high alert as he is looking around in this forest. He's panicked, wondering if this was actually the right thing to do, to bring himself into this forest for the sake of revenge. He doesn't know. He's looking around and looking for anything that can help him. And immediately as he turns around, he looks into the clearing in the middle of this forest, and he sees something incredible. And let's pull out some more cards. Treetarch looks into the clearing, and there he sees what appears to be a stone altar of sorts, with 4 pillars coming up on each of the 4 corners of the altar, stairs coming up on each of the 4 sides, leading to the center. And there, lying in the center of the altar, face down, with a cup, a golden chalice, next to this person is a gray hooded figure with golden blonde hair flowing out from underneath the hood. With his weapon out, Treetarch begins slowly to come closer and closer to the altar, looking around, seeing if there's anything that he can see. And here I want let's take a perception challenge to see if Treetarch actually sees anything. We have 2 odds. We'll make this actually a little more difficult. We need 4 of a kind. Plus 1, throw that one away. There's a 3rd odd and the 4th odd. Yes, so 4 of a kind. As he begins to scan this area, he notices off in the distance, in the trees, not in the clearing, but off in the trees, he sees another stone structure. Something of a temple with an arched doorway with 2 wooden doors that are closed. And on the center of the wooden door, there is a hole. And out of the hole, a light is pouring out, illuminating the area in the forest. And there's also a smoke that is pouring out of the hole. Treetarch walks ever so carefully over to this altar. The stone is worn, covered by green moss, breaking in pieces, cracks going through it. He begins slowly to make his way up the 10 stone stairs. He gets up there and looks down at the person lying there. Begins slowly to walk around the altar to see the face. As he gets closer to the chalice, he suddenly hears a rumbling noise. A rumbling noise as if there is footsteps coming in all directions in the forest. He casts his gaze back to the temple, and he sees the doors themselves also are beginning to quiver. Something is coming. Whether it's in the temple or whether it's in the forest, Treetarch does not really know. He sees the chalice on the ground is now beginning to shake, and he hears this tick, 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 as the metal begins to chatter on the stone altar. He continues to walk around, looking down at this person laying face down on this altar. And as he comes around and kneels down, he is immediately struck by an incredible sight. It is the face of Grayban. And he sees from his face, from his mouth, is trickling out blood. There has been some sort of poison or some sort of liquid that he has consumed in this chalice that has led to this condition. He looks pale in his face. Treetarch bends down to hear for breathing. He hears nothing. Grayban's chest is not moving. The life has completely left him. Treetarch pauses. The rumblings continue to grow. And off in the distance, the doors of the temple now begin to creak open. Treetarch immediately becomes panicked. He doesn't know what to do, so he jumps down off of the altar and tries to hide himself around the corner of one of the stairs, pulling his cloak over him and pushing himself under some of the foliage, trying to blend in. The doors open, and immediately 3 druids begin to walk out. They're carrying some sort of symbol in one hand and satchel in another hand. All 3 of them are carrying some sort of ceremonial items as they begin to walk out. Treetarch hiding himself, covering himself. The question is Treetarch able to cover himself enough that these druids are not going to be able to see him? Let's ask our oracle. 2 cards, 4, 5, 6. So a strong yes. So at this point, Treetarch is completely hidden from these druids. They begin to make their way towards the altar, and the feeling of rumbling, of trembling in the ground continues as Treetarch looks around, and he sees now that there are suddenly coming out of the forest are what looks to be hundreds of these tree-like figures. The same kind of tree-like figures that Treetarch and Sigivald met on their way through the forest. They begin to make their way up to the altar, creating a ring about 75, 80 feet off of the altar, a ring of trees around this altar. Slowly, the 3 druids make their way up the stairs ever so slowly, surrounding the body of Grayban. They place their symbols on the ground, open up their satchels, and all 3 of them stand above Grayban, placing their hands directly out. All 3 of them, at the same time, dip their hand into their satchel, pull out what looks to be a golden dust of sort, and all 3 of them begin a kind of incantation, letting their fingers go as the dust begins to fall ever so gently like snow on a crisp winter morning. The dust falls on the body of Grayban. And slowly this golden glow begins to form around him. And Grayban's body begins to twitch, to move as this golden ray of energy encompasses him. And after a couple seconds, Treetarch hears an incredible thing. Air, oxygen flows into Grayban's body as he immediately sits up, looks around horrified, seeing these 3 druids above him with this ring of tree folk surrounding the altar. Sits up, lets out a scream. "Who are you? Why have you done this? Why have you done this?" One of the druids takes off his hood, and you see a pale face with blazing green eyes. And he looks down at Grayban and begins to speak. Let's take some cards here to see what he is going to say. Okay. Immediately, the druid begins to speak in this horrific voice. "I am here to resurrect you for your soul. We have our what? We have our ceremony in which we will be transforming ourselves into the great Tempest Owl who ruled these lands. And we need a soul. 3 souls, 1 for each of us, which we will sacrifice. And you are the first." There's a tormenting reaction from Grayban as he clutches his head, screaming out in torture. And immediately now, the 3 druids grab him by the neck, and all 3 of them place their hands upon his head as they begin another kind of incantation. Grayban is so weak from his resurrection that he can do nothing but sit there on his knees, being lifted up by the neck and absorbed by this. And immediately there's a rustle and a thumping as the as the trees around them begin to stomp their feet in the ground. This rumbling noise, this cracking noise as this ceremony begins. Grayban begins to scream as the light aura begins to turn to something of a darkish green aura, and an energy begins to flow through his body and immediately pierce the bodies of these 3 druids. You can see now they themselves have this bluish glow coming around them as suddenly, fascinatingly enough, feathers begin to spawn off of their arms as this spell begins to take form. Treetarch, not knowing what to do, holds his breath, thinking to himself, should he run? Should he try to save Grayban? What should he do? And at that exact moment, he is reminded of a spell in which he had learned many years ago, when he and Grayban as children had wandered off together, when they still were friends, when they had wandered off together into the forest to investigate and to play together, when they had gotten lost and they had gotten lost in this deep, dark forest, and they had been saved by the father of Theif, who had pulled them out of the clutches of danger from the forest. And he remembered at this point the spell that Theif's father had taught him. And the father's name is Kanpiar. The spell that Kanpiar had taught them. It was a spell that he taught both of them. Both of these boys. He remembers clearly the words that Kanpiar had said to them that day. "My boys, the forest is a dangerous place, and that is why we have long dwelled in the highlands. Never again shall you enter the forest. But if the forest should come for you, remember these words. And the words were this: Selania, Selania, Selania. And he began to chant this spell. And what Kanpion did was, at that moment, as he was reciting these words, he took the hand of Grayban and he put it into the hand of Treetarch and had them clasping hands as they said this word, Selania, Selania, Selania. Repeat with me, boys, Selania. And both Treetarch and Grayban began to recite this word, Selania, Selania. And as they did this, on the cusp of the forest, immediately the trees began to wither and to fall back as the forest pulled away. This sense of victory over the trees and the forest. As the boys said this louder and louder, the forest pulled further and further back until they ripped their hands apart. And Kanpiar said to them, looking in their eyes, if ever you are in trouble by the forest, remember this word, Selesnia. Sitting there on the edge of the stairs, Treetarch is immediately struck by this memory as it comes back to him. And he knows immediately what he needs to do. He catches his breath, closes his eyes, readies himself. And with a burst of speed, he throws his cloak off of him, turns around, runs up the stairs, jumping forward, putting his elbow down and knocking one of the druids out of place. The druid flies to the side, and immediately now the other druids back off, moving away from Grayban. As he sees what is happening, falls face down onto the altar. The druids, taken aback, look, and all of them snap their heads over at Treetarch, seeing what he is doing. The trees around him, also seeing this movement, immediately begin to charge the altar, coming forward. The roots and the branches are stretching out now, coming to grab Treetarch and to surround him and Grayban. Immediately jumping back, the druids see this, what is going on, with a snarl. The druids cast themselves, jumping back into the circle. And at that moment, Treetarch throws himself down next to Grayban, grabbing his head, looking into his eyes. He has but a split second, and he says to him, Grayban, my friend, remember the word. He grabs him by the hand. Grayban, seeing his friend, foe from a time long ago, a look of confusion shooting into his eyes, but also a look of hope, grabs the hand of his friend, and together they both begin to proclaim, Selesna, Selesnia, 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 shouting it out on the altar, and immediately, there's this burst of white energy flying across the altar, the druids flying backwards, falling off of the altar. They begin to suddenly retch and to shake and to twist as their faces of white begin to turn into stone, this dark, deep-colored cracking and breaking, and the trees around, the limbs, the roots coming towards Treetarch and Grayban begin to crack and break as the trees begin to wither and fall to pieces, branches falling onto the ground, leaves falling down, the trees themselves begin to fall backwards. One after another, the druids on the ground now creaking and cracking, themselves turning into something like wood and breaking, splitting down the center. It looks like 3 statues of druids that have begun cracking and breaking. The energy flies out, enlightening this dark place of the forest, and immediately light goes directly up. Silence. Panting, adrenaline flowing through their veins. Treetarch and Grayban both look up at one another, locking eyes. These former friends turned foes pause for a half second, looking around at what had just happened. And without thinking about it, they immediately embrace one another. They embrace one another, tears pouring down both of their eyes. And after it, feels like an eternity. But in actuality, it was probably only a few seconds. Treetarch holds his former friend turned foe in front of him at arm's length, looking deep into his dark blue eyes. Grayban, I have come here to avenge my honor, to take revenge on you for what you have done to me. Grayban begins to tremble, the lower lip trembling, as he is so weak he cannot flee, he cannot respond. Grayban immediately pulls out his blade that he has on the side of him, raising it up in order to lodge it into Grayban's neck. Grayban now, another tear rolling down his head, his face, as he begins to tremble even more. And Treetarch stops, dropping the blade on the altar. Ting, 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 ting. But I no longer need revenge. I have been avenged, and my honor is returned. Grayban looks at him slowly, and with a weak voice he says, "My friend, I am sorry. I am sorry." With that he collapses onto the altar, still breathing, but unconscious, his body so weak. Treetarch, gathering what strength that he has left after this encounter, reaches down, grabs his friend turned foe turned friend, loads him up on his shoulder, and slowly begins to walk down the stairs of the altar, following the new light path that was opened up from the spell that they recited together. A path that is heading slowly through the forest, ever so slightly upwards, into the peak of the mountains, to the highlands. And ever so slowly, Treetarch begins to make his way home. His honor restored, a friendship renewed, and with hope for a new tomorrow. And that is where we can end this session of Magic the Gathering role-playing.